within the situated cognition approach, theorists talk a lot about the representation of knowledge, and so cognition becomes a matter of representation. This representation of knowledge occurs via signs or symbols, and this process of representation, or semiosis, can be either dynamic or productive. That is, representations can be dynamic in that the representations we use are constantly changing. They may be productive in that they may lead to the development of additional signs or additional representations. I'll give you an example of this in a couple of slides so you can kind of see how this might be related to situated cognition in education. The signs or symbols that we use are determined both by the individual and the environment. So you don't just make up your own representation yourself, you make it up as a function of your interaction within a specific learning context. So, for example, in mathematics we use symbols to portray abstract concepts. We may have different languages, slangs, or dialects that we use in different settings, or maybe we even use the same words to convey different meanings in different settings. We have the same thing with body language and with hand gestures. What they mean and how and when we use them often depend on the culture and the immediate situation. If you've traveled internationally, you often know, or you often hopefully learned, that you have to be very aware of your hand gestures and your body language, because sometimes what is a relatively safe or meaningless gesture in America might be something very offensive or something very personal in a different culture. Within the situated cognition approach, by representing knowledge, we can go from really concrete concepts to really abstract concepts. And how well you can use and interpret the symbols that represent these contexts might depend on things like the quality of the sign itself, how abstract or concrete it is, or how much interpretation do you really have to require to understand it, the context in which the sign is used. That is, we may well understand a sign, but we have a hard time interpreting it outside of its normal context, and how involved you are in the context that surrounds the use of the sign. So, within situated cognition, the success of any sign or any symbolic representation that we might use to represent knowledge depends on the ease of interpretation by its users. If we try to come up with some sort of shorthand for representing knowledge that really is just too cumbersome to be used, then it's not going to be all that meaningful and it's not going to be all that helpful to learners. So now let me give you an example of how semiotic activity within the current educational culture has really changed learning. And this change is a function of web speak. Web speak is also been called webonics or weebonics, refers to the words and phrases that are used to communicate on the web, cell phones, blogs, etc. So this would be things like OMG, LOL. It's a shorthand that we use to talk about a lot of things. Now, I am not an expert in web speak by any means, and so sometimes when I read things on Facebook or when I read things on blogs or get messages from friends, it actually takes me a while to figure out what they're talking about, and I admit I've even had to look a few things up. So if you're also in the position where you aren't a fluent speaker or texter or whatever of web speak, you can click on the link for a dictionary of web speak terms. There are actually a lot in here that I'd never seen or heard of. More relevant to education is we're seeing a lot of web speak terms show up in student writing. I see this even at the college and graduate student levels, and it shocks me. I'm surprised. I'm the child of English teachers, and so the idea that people might use you are for your or something like that in a paper stuns me. But the more I think about it, the more I have to think about how this is such a common symbolic representation that's infused into sort of the digital culture that kids are growing up in now. And so now I understand the prevalence of this. However, there is a debate about the influence of this web speak on learning and education in the next generation. So click the links for videos that really talk about sort of the influence of this on education. Most educators have an initial negative reaction to this overall, that it's ruining teens' understanding and use of language. However, the video often actually presents an alternative point of view for why this might be a good thing and how educators could use this to tap into students' culture and hopefully facilitate learning. The final link on this page actually asks you to consider your own use of WebSpeak, and I think it's coming from a perspective of someone not too far away from me, where you're kind of finicky about language, but then you have to consider, well, what's the utility of WebSpeak in our everyday lives outside of just our own use of formal language? Now, after you've viewed these links and videos, consider WebSpeak within the lens of situated cognition, because students have, or individuals now have so many different technologies available to them, and they can communicate so quickly with all these different technologies. They've had to reduce or symbolize a lot of language to facilitate communication. So we could look at this as a really negative thing because it's changing the English language, or we could look at it as, okay, so the English language or use of the English language is changing as a function of this phenomenon, and so how could we use that in education? I've heard recently of some really interesting examples of people using text messaging as a method of student response systems in classrooms, and so it's a way of sort of turning WebSpeak on its head. Instead of thinking of it as just a purely negative thing, it's looking at how can we use this to facilitate learning, or how can we use the dominant culture, or the digital nation, so to speak, to facilitate learning in a new context. That's the end of the second presentation on situated cognition. Next, go to the applying situated cognition.